My experience with the original Zelda begins long ago. Back around 2004, when I was just a wee lad, I was hardcore into Zelda. I had already played extensive amounts of my first Zelda game, Majora's Mask, as well as The Wind Waker and a little Ocarina of Time. I was deeply invested in the overall Zelda lore, which of course led me to many of the Nintendo and Zelda fan sites that were so prevalent in the early 2000s. Nintendo City, Nintendo Central, etc. There were so many sites that I frequently visited in a concentrated effort to expand my knowledge on all things Nintendo. It was through sites such as these that I learned so much about the history of the company behind my favorite games and the people who made them. It's here that I learned about legends such as Shigeru Miyamoto, Eiji Aonuma, and Koji Kondo. I frequented these sites with an undying thirst for knowledge of the past as well as history in the making. I took every opportunity to find possible tidbits about the upcoming The Legend of Zelda tentative title for Nintendo GameCube. It was perhaps through these steps that I then stumbled upon Zelda Universe, a website with a pretty self-explanatory name. This site was a treasure trove of valuable information on the series, with everything from walkthroughs, character profiles, boss descriptions, secrets and Easter eggs, downloads for the Zelda cartoon, and so much more. My point is, through all this searching and reading, I, of course, knew the story of the original Zelda games. As the first games that kickstarted this series that's so dear to me, I found their simple backstories to be infinitely engaging to read about. This is also perhaps due to me not owning any devices capable of playing NES games and no clear way for me to obtain one. I used to have a Game Boy Advance, but it died sometime before in a bag of chicken juice. But that's a story for another day. Keep in mind, I didn't know about emulation, and my dial-up internet was barely capable of even playing simple QuickTime videos. I could only read and squint at tiny JPEGs. One day, during a visit to EB Games, back before they were devoured by GameStop, I came across something extremely special amongst the used GameCube games: The Legend of Zelda Collector's Edition. This had Majora's Mask, which I already own, and Ocarina of Time, which I had very little experience with outside of playing it for a few minutes on a friend's copy. And I knew how important this particular game was to the series, with it still, along with Final Fantasy VII, being cited as the best game of all time by the general gaming community, 6 whole years after its release. It also included The Legend of Zelda and Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. This was it. I could finally own these pivotal games I've longed to play. Only it costs $44.99 plus tax. What am I, rich? Sure, I could trade in whatever games I did have, but assuming I even knew how trade-ins worked at EB Games, was it worth sacrificing what few games I owned, even for this holy grail of a collection? I didn't think so at the time, and so life went on. Only now with a persistent itch in the back of my mind that could only be scratched by the finely sharpened blade of Link's 8-bit wooden sword. Time went on, and eventually I bought Ocarina of Time on my Nintendo 64 at GameStop for a measly $8. On a side note, it is hard to believe that not long ago, last-gen games could be bought for dirt cheap. If only I could turn back time. Imagine what just a couple $100 could get me. I'd be drowning in the gray cartridges. Anyways, my experience with Ocarina of Time is another story for another time. Majora's Mask, Wind Waker, Ocarina of Time, and from what I could tell from the upcoming The Legend of Zelda tentative title for Nintendo GameCube, all obviously had a lot in common and a lot to love. But one aspect that always captivated me, even more so than the gameplay, the exploration, the music, and all the other wonderful things that this most hallowed of franchises had to offer, was the incredible stories these games told. I knew the Zelda series as being these grand, epic tales of heroism, where each story stands tall on its own, while also interconnecting, making it clear that there was a much larger tale in the works. These were games where you met all sorts of fascinating characters so memorable they leave a life-lasting impression in your mind, and you're always destined to save them from a lurking evil. And all of this is conveyed via beautifully crafted cinematic cutscenes and through expertly written dialogue. The games will make you smile, they'll make you laugh, they'll make you sad, they'll shock you, And because you're experiencing these scenes with the controller in hand, they become all the more personal and all the more memorable in ways other media just could not compare. So, one day, I finally got my hands on the ever-elusive The Legend of Zelda Collector's Edition. I savored the moment, reading the descriptions for each game, watching the beautiful retrospective video that showcased gameplay from all 9 games in the series, set to a brand new rendition of the Hyrule Field theme from Ocarina of Time, watching the trailer for the Wind Waker, and even playing the 20-minute time demo for the game. To this day, I still haven't managed to beat Dragon Roost Cavern within the time limit, though I did make it to the boss before the game cut off. Anyways, after the dust had settled, and I had my fun screwing around and about and whatnot, with a firm grip on my indigo-colored GameCube controller, I was finally ready to play the original The Legend of Zelda. I was soon to witness firsthand the beginning of Link's journey. Princess Zelda's nursemaid, Impa, would be attacked by evil moblins, and, as if from nowhere, Link would come to the old woman's rescue. After which, she would reveal her identity and inform Link of the princess's actions, that she shattered the mystical Triforce of Wisdom and hid the pieces across the kingdom of Hyrule from the evil wizard Ganon before being captured. Impa would entrust Link with the ever-important task of gathering the Triforce of Wisdom, defeating Ganon, and saving Princess Zelda and her kingdom from his evil wrath. I knew the story all too well, but to actually see the events play out before my eyes was sure to be an unforgettable moment. Oftentimes, reality can never compare to thoughts imagined through excitement and hype. I began the game, I listened to that beautifully composed intro theme. The main theme of The Legend of Zelda has persisted in some form through nearly every future game in the series, whether it be the song in its entirety or a few notes sprinkled like a fine spice into another wonderfully crafted recipe of a tune, which is more often the case. The game was off to a good start. Then comes the file select screen. Pushing the control stick in any direction has no effect whatsoever. You have to actually press the select button, or whatever GameCube button the NES select button was mapped to move down the list. Not a big problem whatsoever, but it did take me a while to figure out this antiquated method of menu navigation. Normally this wouldn't even be worth mentioning, but in retrospect, I see this situation as a warning of things to come. Namely, this game's age. Case in point, the next screen of the game. Time to watch that introductory cutscene. I'm ready to read some dialogue and meet some new characters that I'll in time fall in love with. But the game started. And I mean literally, it just started. Little Link standing there in the clearing, ready for adventure. No cutscene, no story, no character interaction, not even an opening fanfare. Absolutely nothing. Press start and start playing. The vague, odorous waft of disappointment can be smelled immediately. But whatever, that's not all there is to a video game, right? I decided to press on. There was a cave on the first screen of the game, and inside the cave was an old man who gives Link his sword, telling him, "It's dangerous to go alone, take this!" Even 3 decades later, these words rest firmly among the upper echelons of famous video game quotes, right next to his closest contemporary. "Thank you, Mario, but our princess is in another castle." With sword in hand, I trekked on forth, eager to explore the great land of Hyrule. After killing a few Octoroks and Moblins, I finally stumbled upon the first dungeon. A detail worth mentioning is that the entrance to the first dungeon is the mouth of a giant tree with a face. In Ocarina of Time, the first dungeon is also a giant tree with a face. Knowing that Ocarina of Time was made to be a prequel to the series up to that point, could they have retroactively made it so that the first dungeon in the original Legend of Zelda is none other than the long-dead remains of the Great Deku Tree? At the very least, it's an interesting theory to ponder. Unlike in the future Ocarina of Time, this first dungeon doesn't actually resemble a tree on the inside. Rather, every dungeon in the original Zelda looks almost exactly the same, aesthetically speaking, with only different color palettes used to differentiate them. From a game design standpoint, they're also all fairly similar, with no dungeon doing anything particularly interesting or new relative to the other dungeons. Dungeon gameplay basically amounts to making your way from room to room until you make it to the boss that guards a piece of the Triforce of Wisdom. This means finding keys to open doors. Keys are obtained from defeated enemies. Or you can open a door by defeating all the enemies in a room, which is where the game is at its most intense. More on that in a minute. Some doors are opened by pushing a block in the correct direction. Finally, you can occasionally make your way to another room by near blindly bombing the walls. Broadly speaking, this has remained the basis for dungeon gameplay for nearly the entire series. It's truly impressive that Miyamoto and Tezuka's team managed to create such an influential formula on their first try, all the way back in 1986. The thing is, that core basic formula is literally all there is to the dungeons in the first Zelda. Subsequent games have managed to expand on the methods originating in the first Zelda to astounding effect, while still maintaining that core. But in the original Zelda, the core is all there is. As I play the game today, even in the right mindset, I don't feel all that engaged. Back when I first played the game, I made it to the first dungeon boss, the awesomely named dragon, Aquamentus. I defeated him by whacking him upside the head with my wooden sword a few times, picked up my heart container, a Zelda staple, and obtained the first piece of the Triforce of Wisdom. After that, I was completely lost. I couldn't find out where to go next. I wandered around and got killed a bunch of times, and it wasn't long before I lost interest entirely and moved on to the next game in the collection, Zelda 2. It would be another year or two before I gave the game another try. This time, I made sure to print out my very own map of Hyrule so I wouldn't get lost. Lots of time has passed and I was older, wiser, and more mature. I knew what to expect from the game and I was eager to enjoy it to the end for what it was, without all the misplaced hype and subsequent disappointment clouding my vision. With the map, the game world suddenly felt way less massive and confusing. I believe there's a reason the third game, A Link to the Past, introduced a map of Hyrule that tells you where to go and what order to go in. It simply makes the game more manageable and less directionless. Some would argue that such hand-holding takes away from the joy of exploration, but I couldn't disagree more. Having a clear vision of your goal doesn't make the journey there any less fun. Less fun would be not having any sort of goal and just blindly exploring until hopefully, by pure chance, you stumble upon the place you need to be. And while I can see why the prospect of blindly exploring can sound appealing, the world of the original Legend of Zelda isn't varied enough visually to find your way around when going in without a map. Not to mention, much of the overworld exploration involves blindly burning totally nondescript bushes and bombing totally nondescript walls in hopes that maybe you'll discover a secret entrance. And on that note, bombs are fairly scarce, and the candle you use for the majority of the game can only be used once per screen, making blind usage almost not even worth the trouble. Anyways, when I played the game with a map for reference, only then did I begin to memorize the layout of the world. Eventually, it got to the point where I didn't need a map. Isn't that how every Zelda game is? You start off by referring to the in-game map until you become so familiar with it that you no longer need it. Many would argue that it's blasphemous to play the original game without a map, as it goes against the developer's intentions and is in fact cheating. I argue that the original game's manual came with a gosh dang map of Hyrule complete with marked points of interest, including dungeon locations. Just as pivotal story information wasn't in the actual game, neither was the map. The manual itself was very much part of the full Zelda experience, back when it first released on NES. So now I had a map and was well on my way to beating The Legend of Zelda. I made it all the way to the 4th dungeon, but then I lost interest. I turned the game off with the intention of continuing, but I just never did. Despite everything, I just wasn't all that into the game. The world is kind of fun to walk around in, but only kind of. The dungeons are fun to tackle, but only kind of. Everything about the original Zelda sets the groundwork that subsequent games would build massively upon, but when you strip away all the bells and whistles of a game like Ocarina of Time or The Wind Waker, leaving only its bare essentials, the original The Legend of Zelda on NES is what you're left with. If there was only one single declaration I can make about the original Zelda, it would be, it's kinda fun. It wouldn't be until I received the game as a 3DS ambassador in 2011 that I would finally beat The Legend of Zelda. At this point, I was much older than the kid who lost interest in the game back in 2006 or so. And yet, my opinion of the game didn't change whatsoever. It was still kinda fun. However, as I made further progress, I began to realize it's also kind of hard. That would be thanks to one certain enemy in the dungeons, the Darknut. These are Ganon's knights that would make appearances all throughout the Zelda series, but never would they be as sinister of a foe as they are in this game. That's all thanks to a few simple reasons. First of all, they always appear in large groups, which would provide something of a challenge for any enemy. Darknuts, however, can only be attacked from their backs or sides. Still, it doesn't sound that bad in theory, but in practice, it's a nightmare of a challenge. They move around in an unpredictable pattern. You can be chasing one from behind only for it to change course at the last millisecond, causing you to lose a heart. Plus, they typically take multiple hits to kill, and did I already mention that they appear in massive groups? These enemies will raise your heart rate and make your palms sweat. If you manage to beat them without dying, you better hope you have a few hearts left over, because sometimes the only way to the dungeon boss is through them. And if you die during the boss because you have too few hearts, because you got brutally assaulted by a gang of Ganon's gnarliest foes, look forward to fighting them all over again. It's definitely a challenge, and it's one you'll have to deal with multiple times through the game. On one hand, it's horrible and far too difficult and unfun. But on the other hand, it's exhilarating and eternally memorable. I can't decide if I love it or hate it, but that just leads me back to the same middle ground opinion I have on the game as a whole. It's kind of fun. So, I beat the game and I felt a rush of satisfaction. I was just so happy to finally finish it after all these years. As such a massive Zelda fan, particularly one who was caught in the middle of post-Ocarina of Time 3D bliss and unfathomable excitement for Skyward Sword, it felt great to proudly declare that I beat The Legend of Zelda. Fast forward to 2019, and Nintendo released a special version of The Legend of Zelda on their Nintendo Switch Online app. It's a save state that starts you off with every item you can possibly obtain without ever entering a dungeon. This means you have max rupees, the blue ring that increases your defense, an upgraded sword, and all the heart containers that can be found in the overworld without the raft. Additionally, every wall that can be bombed has been bombed, and every bush that can be burned has been burned. The point of all this is to eliminate the busy work of hunting for upgrades and allowing you to get into the supposed meat of the game, which is the dungeons. I definitely wouldn't call Zelda SP a better version of the game, as it cuts down on the series staple of exploring a vast world, but it's a novelty that was definitely worth my time finishing, if for no other reason than that it's short in nature as an excuse to replay a game that I only find to be kind of fun. As I mentioned, The Legend of Zelda was the basis for which nearly every future Zelda game would build upon. It was revolutionary at the time, and many aspects of its gameplay would be hugely influential to the video game industry, with even many of the biggest hits out there having their roots planted in Zelda's 8-bit garden. Though it's undoubtedly aged today, in my humble opinion, I know some would say, like wine. The number of influences it had on future Zelda titles are near innumerable, but a few specifics include Link's arsenal of items. With the exception of Zelda 2, bombs and arrows are present in every single Zelda game. The candle was replaced with a lantern in future 2D Zelda games, complete with additional functionalities, and it would make its three-dimensional debut in Twilight Princess. The boomerang stands out as an oddity, with it not being an item one would typically imagine in terms of medieval weaponry like Link's other items. However, it remains one of Link's most reoccurring items, appearing in nearly every game. Even Zelda 2, which wouldn't retain the first game's item system, had enemies that attacked you with boomerangs. The magic whistle that Link used to reveal the entrance to a dungeon plays a simple tune. That tune would be recycled, oddly enough, in Super Mario Bros. 3, where Mario plays a similar looking magic whistle to warp to later worlds. In Ocarina of Time, that simple 6-note tune would be expanded into a full song for the game's title screen. That a simple 2-second long jingle can be transformed into such a beautifully somber and melancholic song is just more proof of composer Koji Kondo's incredible genius. The magic whistle is also the first wind instrument Link gets his hands on in the series, with later examples including grass reeds, a pan flute, a set of horns, a wide assortment of ocarinas, and even a baton that conducts the wind. Music has played a strong role in many games in the Zelda series, and that little magic whistle was quite possibly the root of it all. The red and blue rings would change the color of Link's traditionally green tunic for the first of many times in the series, and the sword upgrades are a precursor to one of the series' most iconic elements this side of the Triforce, the Master Sword. Speaking of the Triforce, this game is especially odd in that it portrays the sacred set of golden triangles as only having two pieces, power and wisdom, the former commonly being associated with Ganon and the latter with Princess Zelda. So, what does that leave the hero Link with? With Ganon seemingly definitively killed and burnt to ash with the power of the Silver Arrow, another reoccurring item in the series, Link grows older and sets out on another quest in Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link.